It is my great pleasure to be moderating this panel discussion on building a resilient future. Thank you all for joining us. I think we can all attest to the fact that the word resilience is being used fairly frequently these days, and while it is arguably only one attribute of many that we might use to describe our desired future in this complex and interconnected world, in that topic alone, there is much to unpack, explore and discuss. And to help us to do that today, I am delighted to introduce our panel members. Professor Sarah Pearson, an internationally respected innovation leader with extensive experience across industry, academia, management consulting, government and science communication. Welcome, Sarah. Dr. Gayan Benedict, CTO of Salesforce Australia and New Zealand and former CIO of the Reserve Bank of Australia. I look forward to hearing his insights of cybersecurity resilience in the light of recent events. Welcome, Gayan.
Thank you.
Professor Mark Howden, Director of the Institute for Climate, Energy and Disaster Solutions at ANU. He's been a member of the IPCC panel since 1991 and shared the 2007 Nobel Peace Prize with other IPC participants and Al Gore, an absolutely extraordinary accolade. Welcome, Mark. And last but by no means least, Professor Jason Sharples, Professor of Bushfire Dynamics, School of Science, UNSW, Canberra. Jason is a mathematical scientist and internationally recognised expert in dynamic bushfire behaviour and extreme bushfire development. He's director of the UNSW Bushfire Research Group, which is dedicated to improving our understanding of the fundamental processes that drive bushfire development and their relation to firefighter and community safety. Welcome, Jason, and thank you. Incredible work. I live in a rural area and felt the full brunt of the relatively recent bushfire season. So very grateful for all your work. So thanks to our panellists. The format for today will be each of the panellists will provide around 5 minutes of introductory remarks and then we'll have Q&A and discussion, which I'm looking forward to immensely. I know that Mark is keen to explore what we actually mean by the word resilience, and he might challenge us to question if it's always a positive thing and whether we have an adequate and shared understanding of what it means. Sarah's going to help us to explore who resilience is actually for. Jason will be talking about resilience in the context of weather events and climate and the critical role of technology and its role in enabling our responses and preparedness. And Gayan will walk us through how he sees managing for resilience as quite distinct from a risk management approach. And I think he's willing to share a few practical tips and tricks too. So that'll be useful. So without further ado, I'd like to invite our first panellist, Professor Sarah Pearson, to provide her opening remarks. Thank you, Sarah.
Great, thank you very much, Jane. And I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land that we're on today and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and also celebrate the 60,000 years of continuous history of innovation and science that we enjoy and can celebrate here in Australia that no other place in the world can do. So I really want to acknowledge that. I'm going to talk, I'm so resilient that I actually have multiple hats, which requires a lot of resilience. And so I want to talk from various lenses about this topic today. And from the perspective of venture capital, from the perspective of global entrepreneurship, and also this concept I came across recently, which is empowerment for economic self-determination. Now that sounds like a very privileged white person thing to say, but it's basically saying, how do we give everyone the dignity of being able to live the best life they possibly can? How can we help that everybody is resilient in this incredibly challenging world that we live in? And so I'm going to start with that question, which is, when we say resilience, who do we hope is going to be resilient? A lot of the work that I do is actually making sure that this wonderful world of emerging science and technology and new economies and growth and jobs is actually not just for privileged people like me, but it's for people all around the world who currently don't have the privileges that I have had. I've just finished a piece of work for the Paul Ramsay Foundation, where I was a fellow there for a year, looking at how can we accelerate the impact of foundations in philanthropy to really break that cycle of disadvantage using innovation. And there are so many great examples of great programs that are doing this. Think of a company I came across called Forte. Global company, they've just done a deal, they're doing deals all around the world, but they've done one with Adelaide around how can they retrain people who are finding themselves dislocated from work because the skills have changed, and they're doing it through a bond. methodology. So they set up a bond structure, people invest in the bond, and then people go through training and they get jobs, and because that generates tax for the government pays back a dividend to the bond fund. So a wonderful way of doing things. In Boston, Black Boston, it's very easy to do things to people, but actually what this foundation in Boston was trying to do was to say, okay, let's empower Black Boston to deal with the challenges they have in the ways that they want to. So they brought in some capability around venture capital and investment, trained people within Boston, Black Boston, to do this themselves, and now there's a fund which is set up that's run by people from Black Boston, which is made, the decisions are made, and the people who are in there, in those regions, are actually delivering some of these solutions. As part of this Paul Ramsey Foundation work I did, I was just so conscious that, I was consulting over 100 people, but they were all like me. And I really wanted people with what's called people call it lived experience, I call it lived expertise. I really wanted to reach out to them, so we did a video. And video introduced them on what they thought about how to help them be more resilient. And it was beautiful to hear from them. They were saying, we can't always do what we've always done, because what we've always done is not getting anyone anywhere. So there's an answer for resilience. Let's stop doing things the way we have, not all of them, but stop doing some of the things we've been doing the way we are and do them differently, and involve people with lived expertise, people who are actually going through these resilience challenges. So moving from a deficit model to one of empowerment. Now there's some great examples globally around how this is happening, and I'm going to give you another beautiful quote from a project that data.org ran in the US. And the respondent said, "You might be a facilitator, you might be an academic, but you don't study poverty, honey, you experience it. And we need to empower those who have to not carry just the burden, but carry the solution, to allow them the space to present that solution." And this is something that we did a lot of at DFAT. So way back when, we really started to try and work aid differently and say there's people in the Global South who've got amazing solutions and resilience that we should be supporting. Some great examples are Impact Ed in India. Now, it was interesting listening to the education earlier. There are children in Cambodian villages that are having personalised education delivered to each individual child in that school, in a hut with no internet connection. Entrepreneurs can do this sort of stuff that really helps with resilience, and I love the work that I do with Global Innovation Fund and Impact Investment Exchange Asia that supports these. There's one that we funded called My Better World. And this is an interesting example of, it's not just about supporting women who are in STEM or women entrepreneurs, it's actually about supporting entities that are changing the whole system. So this My Better World is actually a film that's produced by entrepreneurs in Africa who are trying to stop the violence against women that's happening in Africa. They're just up for an Emmy Award. They're finalists in the Emmy Award, and they're combating domestic violence. On the women's side of things, we've lost a generation. There's a whole generation of women that will not get the equality that they would have got if we hadn't had COVID. So we've got a lot of work to do. We also look at climate resilience. So at Global Innovation Fund, we have a climate resilience and adaptability fund. I know we're going to talk about what resilience means. So how do we adapt to these climate challenges we have? And one example there was women in India who have a business around selling fruit and vegetables. The trouble is some of those fruit and vegetables go off. So there's an entrepreneur that's gone in there with solar power to dry those fruits and vegetables, and suddenly these women now have a revenue stream that they didn't have in the past. Other things that we need to do for this global resilience is actually to help the countries around us. We want geopolitical stability, help the countries around us, help them to build their own emerging economies, countries such as Vietnam, and there's a lot of work between Australia and Vietnam to do that. Lastly, here in Australia, one of my other hats is with Main Sequence Ventures, and we have a load of pillars that are around resilience and adaptability, one of them being decarbonisation, and that is building deep tech companies and jobs here in Australia. Great example, Samsara. We won't need to make plastic anymore because they can take plastic out of anything, make it into the original chemical that it was right from the start, and you can go through the whole process all over again. Or Loam Bio, who are seeing increases in productivity of 6%, but also storing carbon through the work that they do with seeds at a very low cost. And I want to end with this Leave No One Behind, a quote from Elizabeth Broderick in a report that the Australians Investing in Women wrote. "Unless we intentionally include women and girls, the system will unintentionally exclude them. So if we want resilience and adaptability, we also need to put a gender lens across everything that we do intentionally so that no one gets left behind in this amazing and wonderful, exciting world of emerging science and technology, which will help us adapt with resilience. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone. Really looking forward to this discussion. It's a great discussion. I've enjoyed the earlier panels as well. First I wanted to give you a little bit of background of myself and why I'm really looking forward to a conversation on resilience. It's been a big part of my life for the last 20 or so years. And I wanted to bring a perspective that's informed by my current role, but also some of the work I've done previously with the RBA. So first of all, I'm here as Salesforce's Chief Technology Officer for the region for Australia and New Zealand. Some of you, probably many of you, may be asking, who is Salesforce? You may have heard of the brand, you may be seeing it on buildings. We've got a big tower coming up in Circular Quay for those of you who are frequently in that part of Sydney. And if you've ever seen San Francisco in the last decade, you would have seen the big Salesforce tower that sort of emerged into that space as well. So Salesforce is the largest trusted provider of customer management software in the world. And as part of that, it spends a lot of time delivering technology to governments, companies, not-for-profits, around managing very sensitive and important customer information. So obviously you can imagine that's a very topical issue right now in Australia in particular, but globally, as we know. Previous to Salesforce, I was the CIO for the RBA, and my accountabilities there encompassed technology resilience, cyber resilience, and keeping national payment infrastructure up and running, obviously with a very large team and the entire sector focusing on that, but also federal government banking and looking after things like banknote generation and circulation, which encompassed and included the latest generation of banknotes that Australia's just released over the last 5 or 6 years. As part of the CTO role I have in Salesforce, that also involves industry research collaboration, and so there's a lot of work working at universities. I'm an industry research fellow at ATSE, working with the curriculum advisory at that area, in that faculty of engineering and information technology. One thing I will say is that resilience comes up in almost every conversation that I have and that we have at Salesforce, and that I've experienced with the RBA as well. And for me, over the years, my views of resilience have evolved and changed. And this is really largely based on, I think, the complexity and the nature of the challenges that we're facing. So I wanted to really cover 3 key points and then really look forward to joining the discussion in the panel as well. The first thing I'll say is I think as we look towards the future, and that's what this panel is really looking at, how building a future that is resilient, I think that it goes without saying that the future that we're facing is really confronted by a multiplicity of challenges. We talk about climate, and that's a big feature of the conversation, social, economic, cultural challenges, and certainly one that occupies a lot of my time is digital disruption and challenges. What's interesting in the period that we're experiencing now and the periods in front of us is the overlapping and concurrent nature of those disruptions, and how they're really occurring together and almost multiplying their impacts on our broader culture and society. And that gets me to my second point, which is the intersectionality of these challenges. It's interesting, I think, if you look at some of the challenges I just mentioned. We've had a global pandemic. In some ways, it's influenced or accelerated a move to digital transformation. You'll often hear that in the business and government circles. And that's been necessitated by, for some folk who are lucky enough to be able to do this, that shift to working from home. Organisations have had to shift the digital footprints in a way which they maybe didn't have before, whether it's stores, businesses. And that's then created a greater exposure to cyber risk. And so, what started in one sort of cascading set of risks that are crystallising then created shocks in other realms, which are now manifesting in completely different ways, featuring in the news most recently in Australia. Another good example is the geopolitical risks that we've seen and the challenges we're seeing in Europe right now, and how that's then led to supply chain challenges, which is then leading to increasing costs of fuel, which then has economic shocks. So you can see that the relationship between a lot of these individual risks occurring is very intersectional, and sometimes what we end up dealing with is something quite different to what actually initially triggered and caused the current crisis. So that's really the second point I wanted to talk about, which is the intersectionality of the risk, which really brings me to the third and final point I was going to raise, and Jane alluded to it before. In my time at the RBA looking at technology and cyber risk, we had a big focus, and every organisation I know has a big focus on identifying all the clear risks that they face. And they go through the traditional conventional approach of then saying, what is the inherent risk that we face? What are the potential controls or mitigants we can place to treat those? And then ideally we want to reduce the residual risk. But increasingly, as you have these intersectional risks compounding and multiplying each other, taking a granular sort of risk-based approach to things, what I describe often as a bottom-up approach to risks, often leaves you exposed to blind spots. Things which you may not have actually thought about from an individual risk perspective, but because of this compounding and cascading nature of things, you have a shock. And the shock then causes you to have to respond, and you have to react and ideally try to fix the issue. And when you go back, if you have the luxury of doing so, you try to trace back, well, what actually caused it? And there's rarely one risk or one issue. It's often their combined effect. And so I think what we're seeing now is an increased dialogue around resilience rather than specifically risk management. It's interesting for me, resilience features as the panel topic. And for me, resilience and a resilience mindset is much more focused around focusing on the outcomes that you're trying to address, and then working back from those outcomes to say, what can we do in an effective and an efficient way and in a targeted way to try to address or mitigate the outcomes occurring. So it's much more of an outcome-based focus, and therefore I would say a top-down based approach, which can then work well with a more traditional risk-based approach, which looks at individual risks and looks at the controls treating them. So I think as we look at resilience for the future, being mindful of the complexity of the challenges we face, the intersectionality of those challenges, and being mindful that often there isn't just a simple single cause, and therefore we have to be creative, we have to be flexible and diverse and adaptive in how we address those outcomes, and those crises that we want to avoid is really important. So I'm really looking forward to the conversation and the rest of the panel speakers. Thank you.
So thanks, Gayan and Sarah, and also to Jane for introducing the session. So I'm probably going to stir the pot a little bit here and have a slightly almost dissenting voice here, and that is actually question whether resilience is actually a particularly useful concept for us at this point in time. And there's several threads to this argument. I haven't got time to go into all of them here. But part of it is that resilience is an extraordinarily diffuse concept, and it's used in different ways in different circumstances. And often those, as I'll talk about in a minute, those usages are diametrically opposed to each other. And so when you actually have a situation like that, the question for me is whether, in fact, using alternative framings and phrasings is actually a more constructive way of doing things. So I would see resilience as having a legitimate role in terms of bringing people together at the start of a conversation. So where you have these different perspectives on a need to deal with change and disruption, then bringing people together with a broadly understood or broadly accepted sort of starting point is useful. So it's what I'd call constructive ambiguity. So you have different views, but you can get people inside the tent to actually have some form of engagement with each other. But once you actually start to operationalise it, it starts to fall apart. So anyone who's actually tried to evaluate resilience, you'll actually find that it's actually an extraordinarily slippery concept and very difficult to get something that's concrete to evaluate with. And so once you actually start to go through that process, you actually start to think, well, what are the actual things we want? And they may actually be flexibility, they may be adaptiveness, they may be ability to resist change, it may be to shorten recovery times and enhance recovery processes, each of which are much more tractable and manageable and definable and able to be evaluated. So I think when we actually start to delve into this, we start to think, okay, resilience is a useful starting point for a conversation, but it's not a particularly useful point to end a conversation. And I think what we need to do at the moment is we recognise there's a whole range of challenges sitting around us, and we need to find ways of acting to deal with those challenges in a coherent way. Secondly, I think when you look at this, there's a very big difference between the common usage of the word resilience, which tends to be the bouncing back concept, and the scientific use of the word and framing of resilience, which is actually often the characteristics of the system. So bouncing back is actually a response or an outcome of the system. The resilience in the scientific concept is actually the characteristics, the internal dynamics of a system. So they're very different things. And as I mentioned before, you can see that there's diametrically opposed elements within how resilience often is used. So resilience can deal with characteristics of a system or an outcome of a system. They are fundamentally different things. It can be focused on change, or it can be focused on stasis. So bouncing back is about stasis. A resilience in the scientific sense is about change. It can actually be about looking at things like what was my other example here? Oh yeah, proactive and reactive elements. So there's the common usage of is a reactive response, the scientific use is a proactive response. So you see there's diametrically opposed elements there. And when you have that diametrically opposed elements, you have to wonder what you're actually doing in terms of using that framing. The other thing is that resilience tends to be used in a sort of a sense which is very positive, so I'm resilient, I'm good, that type of thing. Whereas in fact, that it is not a value statement, because you can have resilient systems which are problematic, so herbicide resistance in weeds, dictatorships in countries are extraordinarily resilient systems and factors. And so resilience by itself is not a good thing. And when you actually start to look in at this, we can see the usage of this term and the framing of it and the desire for responsiveness along these lines can actually be weaponised. And so in fact that there's a literature right now you can look at the dark side of resilience or the weaponisation of resilience, which is actually a legitimate critique of resilience. And fundamentally it goes around the basis of it's actually used as a way of avoiding responsibility and avoiding taking action rather than actually dealing with the issue at hand. And lastly, I guess I just want to sort of mention that when we're actually sort of having these discussions, I think if we want to have discussions sensibly, we should actually have a focus on what we want to achieve. And as I said before, I think that's dealt with by using much more direct language and much more appropriate concepts which actually embed action within them. So instead of bouncing back, which is the fundamental concept of resilience, I actually suggest we should actually have bouncing forward and bouncing forward better as a fundamental framing thing. And then we build ideas around that and we build programs around that. Thank you.
All right, hi, thanks. Just wanted to start out by acknowledging the fact that we're here on Gadigal country today, and just pay my respects to the Gadigal elders across time, and also to acknowledge my Aboriginal brothers and sisters out there in the audience. There's a few of us, but we're growing in number. So really what I wanted to do today was just, I guess, highlight a few examples of how science and technology is helping us build resilience, in the traditional sense of the word, I guess, Mark, to natural hazards, and in particular to extreme bushfires, which is my sort of particular niche. So extreme bushfires or violent pyroconvective events are becoming more prevalent. They manifest often as what we call pyrocumulonimbus storms, fire thunderstorms. You can see the cumulative total there on the screen. And what's pretty clear is they're increasing in prevalence. You can sort of see the black summer season there standing out. So when we talk about these particular hazards, we're talking about things which don't really match the ordinary concept of a surface wildfire. So these things really present a unique set of hazards compared to the traditional fires that we are pretty well equipped at dealing with. These sorts of events are as much atmospheric events as they are ordinary surface fires, and it's really these sorts of events which are responsible for the lion's share of the impacts, and those impacts span a whole bunch of different dimensions, okay? Social, economic, cultural, environmental, and all these things impact on each other and interact together, as Graham was saying. So really, as I said, these present a unique set of challenges compared to ordinary wildfires, and we can't really understand these hazards and the challenges that they face without advanced mathematical and computational modelling, okay, and the technological innovations that we use to inform these models, and these are things like airborne scanners, satellite platforms, and so on. So, and really, if you look at that graph there, you can see it only goes back to about the start of the satellite era. We're highly dependent on satellite technology there to actually be able to even define whether one of these events has occurred. The catastrophic nature of these events means that we can't really resort to sort of traditional methods of bushfire science, which often included actually going out and doing controlled field experimentation. Okay, you can't sort of walk along beside one of these taking measurements, as has been done in the past. So really what we have to accept is that when these events occur, these are our experiments. These are our chance to collect data on these things and learn more about them. Okay, so really what we're talking about there is trying to capture data literally on the fly through aircraft and so on, and really trying to use the best technology we have available to make the most of those opportunities. Okay, often we have to try and make the most of those opportunities in competition with other sort of operational interests. Okay, so using the use of drones around fires is a very highly sort of controversial issue with contested airspace. Much of what we've learnt about these fires over the last couple of decades has really come down to advances in our ability to model the physical processes that drive the escalation of these sorts of fires into these large conflagrations. And through the modelling, being able to identify some of the environmental thresholds that go along with these processes, which gives us a sort of a higher level or high ability to sort of enact a kind of bushfire triage. Okay, so if you've got 100 fires burning on the day, which are the ones which are going to be the most problematic, which are the ones you're going to need to warn people about sooner, and so on. So these models, they tend to, I mean, they're fairly recent. I mean, these are sort of developing as we speak, but the real key to them is that they're able to capture the complex interactions between the fire, the environment, and the atmosphere. They're, by their very nature, computationally intensive. Okay, you can't play with these things without a supercomputer, which means that these models by themselves aren't that much use to making operational decisions. But what we've been doing, I guess, in the last few years is making progress in developing models of reduced complexity, which are able to capture all the key dynamics that are going on and driving these sorts of events, but able to still be able to run these models within operational timeframes, which means you're then able to use them to inform decision making in what is often a very quickly evolving operational environment. So not only can we use models to understand these sort of hazards at a large scale, we can also use them to understand hazards at smaller scale. And as I said before, the hazards associated with these sorts of events are unique, and their increased prevalence in particular requires really, I would say, a rethink of the way that we approach mitigation measures such as building standards and so on. The current building standard, the Australian Standard for Building in Bushfire-Prone Landscapes, AS 3959, pretty much explicitly says all houses burn down due to radiant heat. Now, we've known that's not the case for about 20 years, I would say. Okay, so there's a real challenge there to say, well, how do we use this new knowledge that the models are giving us and giving us insights into? How do we then incorporate that into things like the building standard and other levels of emergency management and government? Okay, so for example, the building standards might want to include something like ember attack that you can see on the screen, and also things like strong pyrogenic winds, which just aren't there at the moment. So really, I would say if you're talking about trying to enhance the resilience or build resilience into new or even existing urban developments on the rural-urban interface, what we really need to do is we need to come up with a comprehensive understanding of the hazard, okay? Not the hazard that we were sort of thinking about 20 or 30 years ago, but the hazard that we're facing now, okay? So we really need to get sort of strict with ourselves and say we need to be faithful in addressing the hazard. So this understanding, the goal is you can sort of take this modelling information, combine it with other various facets, urban design principles, for example, and really try to think about how do you start to build this knowledge into new developments and actually, increase the inherent resilience of these sorts of communities. So I'll stop there.
Wonderful. Well, thanks, everyone. Are these mics on? Can everyone hear me all right? All right. Okay, we've got Mike now. Thanks, everyone. All right, well, thank you so much for your insightful thoughts. There's so much to think about there. I suppose one of the things that came out of those 4 sets of opening remarks was that resilience can mean multiple things in various contexts. So I wanted to start, and I note that there are no questions yet coming through from the audience, so feel free to pop them through on the online mechanism or wave, and hopefully there's a roaming mic around as well, so do let me know if there's questions. But perhaps we can start with pulling the threads of that conversation together a little, noting that resilience can mean different things in different contexts. And at a high level, there's a fair bit of ambiguity. I heard from Mark and Gayan a notion that perhaps it's better to start these conversations, or use resilience to start the conversations, but then move quickly to what are the outcomes that we're intending to achieve. Would anyone like to comment on that as perhaps a useful starting point for the conversations around resilience?
Comment?
Mark,
Sure.
how about you
I'll
kick
kick
off?
that off. I think there's probably a first step, and that is to engage with the people who are affected by specific decisions about what their values are and what they want to achieve. And from there you actually move to desired outcomes, and from there you actually move to pathways to achieve those desired outcomes. And almost always there's an iterative element there, because you won't hit that right in the first instance. But for me, it is about sort of teasing these things out in a substantive way, and one which can generate more equitable and informed responses.
Okay, fantastic. Gayan?
Yeah, I'll add to that. I think the benefit of thinking about the outcomes is that you're actually also thinking about the impacts. And ultimately, when you're looking at resilience from whatever perspective, you're trying to either encourage certain impacts or actually reduce certain impacts. So you want more of the good stuff and less of the bad stuff. So I think one benefit of outcome-based approach is that you look at the good or the bad and you work back from that. And it allows you to think, well, maybe this outcome is because of a combination of things that could have occurred. Maybe a number of different situations could have occurred. Is there any particular solution or remediation we can put in place that may compensate for multiple potential causes? So it allows you to take a more holistic approach, I think, to actually putting in some addressable solutions that may potentially address multiple negative outcomes. So I think that there is a benefit largely because it emphasises the impact.
Right, okay. Jason, you mentioned...
Go for it.
Quickly to Jason and then to you. Jason, you mentioned it's imperative to understand the hazard. How does this outcomes-based approach sit with that need to understand the hazard?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's crucial. I mean, if you want specific outcomes, I mean, you still need to try and think, well, what particular hazard or risk am I trying to build resilience to? Okay, and depending on what that is, will frame the measures you take to try and address that. But without knowing what you're trying to build resilience to begin with, you're a little bit lost. I mean, I guess an example of that would be something like, if you're trying to achieve net zero to mitigate the effects of climate change, then you might think, okay, well, one of the solutions to that is to enhance the electrification of the network, build more electrical infrastructure. But when you do that, you also increase the chance of fire ignition. So you sort of need to think about all these different sources of risk and how they interact with each other.
Absolutely, and to Gayan's point about multiplying effects and compounding effects, it becomes very complicated very quickly. Sarah?
I'd love to build on Jason's point, particularly around the supply of electricity, because, in terms of resilience, you can go, well, we'd be really resilient if we do what we've been doing in the past, but more of it. And yet, actually, if you do something completely different and made sure that everybody could be part of microgrids and they could be looking after communities through battery sharing, etc. So there's a completely different way of providing resilience. And so I think that's one thing, is thinking about resilience and not thinking it with your old hat on, thinking completely differently about what the future could look like. And then secondly, resilience is a little bit like the word innovation. Innovation isn't actually anything until there's an impact or an outcome. And resilience, it's pointless unless there's some outcome around resilience. And I know there's been a propensity to go, okay, let's do innovation, let's tick the box. But that's left Australia where we are now, which is going backwards in terms of our global competitiveness. So the same with resilience, let's all be resilient, let's get a gold star on resilience. Well, it's not going to actually make any difference unless we actually do something different and there's outcomes for that. And I'll tell you what, you talk to people around the world, like let's talk about people in the Pacific Islands. Oh, let's go and make them more resilient. Yeah, great. Well, their islands are disappearing. If you're just doing it without thinking about what the outcomes are, then it's absolutely pointless.
Okay, it sounds like there's broad agreement that we need to unpack that fairly quickly and get a bit more specific about what impact and outcomes we're after. Let's stick with batteries, energy and electricity for a moment. There's a question from the audience, from Rachel. What role do you think renewable technology such as batteries has to play in increasing the reliability and resilience of energy supply? And how do we drive the adoption of it? Who'd like to tackle that one first?
Look, I'm not an expert, so maybe there's an expert on the panel that would like to... I have got some views, but...
Not
No, okay.
but
So,
you go. Yeah.
okay, so one of my hats is I'm on the board of RACQ, Royal Automobile Club of Queensland. And it's a fascinating transition we're going through, because it was, petroleum cars and now moving to EV, quite possibly, rapidly. And so for that, you then need to have resilience around how do people actually then charge up their cars at home. If you look at the stats, it's something like 90% of charging happens at home. So immediately that question about batteries and resilience comes in. The challenge is, batteries are so expensive, and it's challenging for people to be able to afford that. So from a resilience perspective, there's one first question: how do we make sure that everybody gets an opportunity to transition to these new technologies? Part of that is around something that we're pushing for, is actually local community batteries. So then you, as a community, you could share your batteries, or share your energy through a battery, or you could just be part of some community battery storage and benefit from that. But then there's all sorts of challenges that go with that. And to your point about how do you get people to do that, I was asking, because something I'm just really excited about is energy as a service. Like, I don't care where my energy comes from. I just want my microwave to work, my oven to work, I want them all to work. I don't care. If you could tell me you're going to guarantee that's going to work, wouldn't that be brilliant? But the trouble is, part of that would mean some huge transitions in consumer behaviour. And how do you get people to make those changes? I feel I'm just a natural optimist, and I think we are facing massive energy shocks and energy price shocks, and never waste a disaster like that. I think we're possibly in a point in time when there'll be a lot more opportunity to be driving that sort of behaviour change.
Great, thank you. Mark?
And just to build on what Sarah said, is that there are specific sort of aspects of having batteries as part of microgrids which actually provide sort of robust power supplies in the case of disruption. So we heard yesterday a reiteration of how people on the south coast during the Black Summer, they were disconnected, the electricity system went down, communications went down, people couldn't pump petrol, they couldn't withdraw cash, etc., because the system had gone down. So establishing microgrids which have a battery component are ways of actually overcoming those disruptions in those locations. Yeah.
Okay, fantastic. Our panel session has gone quite quickly. We actually only have a few minutes left, although we did start a few minutes late. I'm going to try and cram at least 3 more questions in. And I wanted to start with a question next about a bit of a practical question about the evaluation of resilience, noting the caveat that we need to better define resilience. But running with that word for a moment, how will we know that we're on track, that we're becoming more resilient? We can certainly measure the events that happen, and we're certainly seeing no shortage of those in every facet of life at the moment, whether it's cybersecurity breaches or natural weather events and the crises associated with those. But we can't measure the counterfactual. So how can we measure our progress and have a sense of confidence whether we're on track or not?
I like, Mark, your term before around bouncing forward better, because I think for me one of the characteristics of a good, healthy, resilient system is one where, despite shocks and negative inputs, it's still able to actually operate in a healthy state, whatever healthy is and however you define it. So I think, the shocks and the challenges we've got in front of us across multiple dimensions are not going away. It's the fact that we can operate in a healthy state and sort of be talking about quality measures like well-being and mental health and the efficacy of our economy, and say that it's still operating well despite all of those shocks. So for me, that's one of the measures of a maybe a more commonly described resilient system.
So it's a really good question, I think, and I think there's a few different answers. One is you can look at how you're setting up your system. So, do we have effective emergency services, for example, to deal with floods, etc. So you can look at the input side of things. You can also look at the outcomes, so you can actually see where you've had disruptions and how your system handled that. So that's the emergent properties of your system as a metric for resilience or adaptability or flexibility or agility or whatever you want to focus on. And thirdly, I think you can actually deal with, at least in some circumstances, the counterfactual, because if you actually have a model, or people use the digital twin sort of language these days, if you have a decent model of your system, you can actually run those experiments to see how your system will respond to perturbation. So I think there are different ways of looking at this and evaluating how effective our approaches are.
Jason.
Yeah, I guess just to add to that, I think it's much easier to answer the question, how do we measure that we're becoming less resilient? And there's obviously a very quantitative measures in terms of direct costs and things like that you can do to measure that. But I think there's also more important intangible measures like mental health impacts. And that's become a really big one in the emergency services industry of late. Chairing an international firefighter safety summit next month. That's the first time in the 20 years that this summit's run that there's a session on mental health. So that speaks enough already. But the fact that we're getting fire seasons which are now lasting much longer than what they have, the northern hemisphere fire season and the southern hemisphere fire season are starting to merge into each other. There's less time for firefighters to recover. There's less opportunity for resource sharing as well, which produces extra burdens financially as well. So I think there's a real need to sort of try and see that these sorts of problems are coming, and try and act proactively in terms of the way we govern emergency services to try and address that.
I think it would depend on the outcome you're trying to drive. So back to that earlier question. And Australia must be such a great test bed to look at that. Goodness, the last 3 years have been unbelievable. And yet, look how resilient we are. When the federal, if you want to do it from a GDP perspective, the federal, your economic growth, federal government was showing all those bar charts in terms of us compared to other countries. We've been unbelievably resilient, considering we had everything else as well as COVID. So it must be a brilliant test bed. So that's the first point. Second point is, I'd encourage whoever is doing it to think broadly about how they make those decisions about what to measure. And I want to bring up social impact investing. So the Global Innovation Fund, we actually measure the impact of something we're going to invest in before we invest in it. So for our climate adaptability, we actually measure how will this impact the humans who live on less than $5 a day that we're trying to help through these entrepreneurs. How much will that impact be on individuals? So there's all sorts of different measures, and I'd encourage people to draw on many diverse ones.
Fantastic. We have 2 minutes left, so I'm going to ask one more question and ask for a very short answer from each of our panellists. This question comes from Brad. We know and acknowledge that Indigenous people have survived this driest inhabited continent 65,000 years, suggesting a little resilience is built in. How can old Indigenous knowledge influence a resilient future? Jason, we'll start with you and move along the line.
Yeah, it's got a huge role to play. We just probably need to listen and actually give some people a chance to tell us about what Indigenous knowledges tell us about this. There's a real challenge there, I acknowledge, about combining different ways of knowing. There's been a lot of work been done around that. Brad, the question asker, was instrumental in that, of course. But yeah, there's huge potential. Just in terms of fire. Fire management was something that's been done just as intrinsically as part of Aboriginal society for thousands of years. It was suddenly cut off, and we know from the data that fire frequency went up almost immediately after that. So there's a real challenge there to sort of say, well, how do you perhaps bring some of that sort of knowledge back in now that countries changed, climate's changed? How do we start to introduce those sorts of ideas again?
Mark.
Yeah, look, I think my response would have been very similar to Jason's, but I think it is actually about dealing respectfully with different types of knowledge and looking for those opportunities to bring those knowledges together to face the issues we're dealing with contemporaneously, but also taking a long-term view of this. So there's, I think, significant questions about our structures and norms in society and how they should be challenged and questioned with alternatives.
Yeah, look, I think our Indigenous culture and wisdom is one of the greatest things we have in Australia, and I think we've talked about intersectionality before. Bringing that wisdom in and building on it and leveraging it and learning from it is just key to, I think, our resilience going forward. And I think we've made the initial steps, but there's so much more to be done.
Sarah. I'd like to say it's insane that we haven't and that we don't. I talked right in my talk about lived expertise. You bring in the lived expertise. What I would love to see Australia have is actually a team of change warriors. So people with all sorts of different expertise, including our First Nations expertise, who could wander around Australia and go and fix some of these massive challenges that we have collectively.
Wonderful. And maybe we can add that it's not only the specific expertise, but different ways of thinking, which brings in that diversity point from yesterday. Thank you all. We've run out of time. Would you please join me in thanking Jason, Mark, Guyan and Sarah for our panels this morning.